The history of Christianity normally gets told in very Eurocentric fashion. There's a big focus on Christianity in the Greco-Roman world, which then grows into the church of the Greek Orthodox in the East and the Roman Catholic Church of the West. And you've got the Middle Ages, you've got the Reformation, then you've got missionary expansion into the Americas. But what about the churches in the Middle East and Central Asia and beyond? They normally get neglected or forgotten in normal histories of Christianity, or the average church history course that you may take at college or in seminary, which is why this book by Philip Jenkins was so eye-opening for me when I read it, I think, about a dozen years ago, because it showed that in the Middle East and Central Asia, there was some major Christian activity. There were numerous churches and dioceses between Baghdad and parts of China. And that tends to be forgotten or lost in normal narrations of the history of Christianity. And we've also got to consider as well the history of Christianity in India, in the subcontinent. Now, according to tradition, it was the Apostle Thomas who was commissioned by the risen Jesus to take Christianity to India. And that becomes a very important tradition in the church. In fact, just down the road from where I am, there is a Mar Thoma church, a St. Thomas church for the Indian Christians. That's basically a church that has a Syriac liturgy, but it has a Reformed theology. And they're very much sold on the tradition that St. Thomas brought Christianity to India. And if you want to see more about that, you can read the Acts of Thomas. That's the story that we have, that he was commissioned to go to India, and there he preached the gospel with a big emphasis on celibacy, no less, but he was the one who brought Christianity to India. But is that really how it happened? Because the Acts of Thomas, the story about Thomas taking Christianity to India, it does seem to be more of hagiography rather than history, or maybe there is a bit of history mixed in with the hagiography. I mean, that's the sort of debates that we have. But one book that recently tackles the topic of the spread of Christianity to India is this volume by Dr. Nathanael Andrade. It is a great volume. It is a good study of what we can really say about the journey of Christian culture into India. Not necessarily the first Christians to arrive in India, but what we can say definitively about when Christian culture, or the evidence that it's really there, first begins to emerge. And what Andrade looks at is the major trade routes, both in the Red Sea and across land through Syria, the Levant, the Iranian plateau, and into Central Asia. He looks at that. He looks at when, where, and how people were traveling. He looks at various modes of communication, what social networks were like, how religions kind of pick up and move along. And he can make some comparisons with things like Manicheanism and others. And I like the book so much, I decided I would do an interview with Nathanael, with Dr. Andrade. And it was a good discussion. So I've got this discussion here for you now. You can listen to the interview that we did. You can listen to the good doctor himself talk about his view, or what he learned from his study on how Christianity came to India. Okay, I'm joined with Dr. Nathanael Andrade from the University of Binghamton in New York State. Thank you for joining me, Nathanael.
Oh, thanks so much, Mike, for inviting me to be on here. I'm really excited.
Oh, that's great. I've read a couple of your books. The first one was on Syrian identity in the Greco-Roman world, and I learned some interesting things from that book alone. That in Syro-Palestine, you could find the Greeks and the Syrians aligning themselves against the Jews, and yet in Mesopotamia, or in Parthia, you could find Jews and Syrians aligning themselves against the Greeks. So, I mean, you get some very interesting ethnic rivalries and ethnic mixes, and the whole thing about whether Syrians considered themselves to be Greek or were they Arabian, Persian, Parthian. I thought that was an interesting exploration of Syrian identity. in a way that kind of people in my area explore, Jewish identity. What does it mean to be Judaismos? But the book we want to discuss today is this one, The Journey of Christianity into India in Late Antiquity. Now, I don't know where you sit in the religious world, Nathaniel, but we had this guy called Saint Thomas, and he's kind of a big deal. And we were of the opinion that he took Christianity to India probably around 70 AD. But after reading your book, I'm starting to think that may no longer be the case. I'm starting to think that the whole Thomasine traditions may be nothing more than a form of hagiography. But as we broach that topic, the first thing we have to get into is exactly when Roman authors spoke about India, what did they mean by that? Because I have a feeling it's not necessarily what everyone else thought by India. So what did Roman authors or Greco-Roman authors think when they referred to India?
Well, I think there's a lot of variety, of course. Sometimes when they do talk about India, they more or less talk about, what we would call India, if they're, of course, writing in Greek and Latin. But I would say in the late ancient period, when we really start to have, I think, the movement of Christianity accelerating, typically India can include East Africa. I think it can include Southeast Asia, certainly Arabia. And so there's a lack of fixity when it comes to what people mean when they talk about India or Indians. And this, of course, complicates how we understand the movement of Christianity to India, because when we're encountering the phenomenon in the material, we have to ask which India. And this is, of course, an age-old question that people are always trying to address in essence, but I think the opinions vary tremendously. So I stick to my position on that, but it can mean a lot of different things for sure.
Yeah, I mean, all the like parts of Ethiopia, Arabia, India, and just almost anywhere exotic is considered, Indian or anything like that. I mean, that's the interesting thing. Now you make a big focus on the major trade networks and the social networks that go with them, and you kind of point to two main ones, if I'm understanding you correctly. What were the main trading routes to get from the Mediterranean, shall we say, all the way through to places like India and Sri Lanka?
Well, the two main routes, I would say, and there's actually a third one, and I should probably talk about it too, even though I didn't talk about it in the book. But the main one that has been discussed quite a lot, especially in the last 10 to 20 years, is the route that typically would lead from Egypt through the Red Sea and into the Arabian Sea and thus to India. And there's a critical mass of evidence indicating that that was an important form of connectivity, really between the Indian Peninsula, in a sense, and, say, Red Sea, Egypt. And otherwise, a main route goes through Syria and Mesopotamia into the Persian Gulf, and then thereby typically by sea to India, especially North India, but farther afield. And that route would, of course, go quite a bit overland, and then by sea through the Persian Gulf. I didn't discuss it as much, but since it's been a few years since the book came out, I suppose that if I could do it again, I would also talk about how people were moving up and down Arabia. And in theory, they could come in from the Indian Ocean and then across Arabia into the Levant or the Eastern Roman Empire. That's not something that I discussed, but I think that's also a valid way for, say, culture to travel as well as come up.
And some of these trade routes were more active at different periods. If I understand your book correctly, the sort of, going south down the Nile, crossing land, then going into the Red Sea, all the way through to India, where I think there was even like a Roman colony or embassy at India or at one point. That was very big in the first century, but then it kind of lags or falls by the wayside in the third century, which is a pretty difficult time for the Roman Empire. And after that, the next big period is in the fourth century, where you get a reopening of trade with India, but mostly going through the Levant, Mesopotamia, the Iranian Plateau into Central Asia. What difference does that make about the when and the how that these trade routes are active? What does that tell us about the migration of religions based on those, which routes are open and when?
Right. Well, I think the question of which routes are open and when is a significant one. For a couple of reasons. They need to be open in the first place, really, for culture to travel, including Christian culture. And what a big part of the book was also mapping who was going where on those routes. It makes a big difference, for example, in terms of whether Romans are going directly to India or Indians directly to the Roman Empire, or whether they're meeting at intermediary points. Because if there are more intermediary locations and points involved, then technically there has to be more conversion and more interaction for culture to travel. So one way that I was picturing it is that, okay, if Romans go directly to India, of course they can lay Christian routes in India. But if they're only going part of the way, they have to find ways to transmit Christian culture to intermediaries who then have to take it to India. So in terms of my own research, what I basically ended up concluding was that at the peak times of direct contact between, say, the Roman Empire and India, there weren't actually a lot of Christians doing the traveling between those two locations. If we're talking about, say, merchants or ambassadors and the like, I think we're really talking mostly about traditional polytheists or whatever you want to call them. Then in the 3rd century, that trade connection gets disrupted. And when it's revived, Roman Christians are now active in it, but they're not going all the way to India. I think they're mostly stopping in South Arabia, East Africa. And that means for Christianity to get to India, they're not going to be the ones bringing it. It has to be other people that they're in contact with. And sometimes when you're talking about conversion for reasons that I certainly can't explain, sometimes it happens rapidly. Sometimes it happens not so rapidly. It may take generations, right, for the transfer to be made and for people to complete the trip. So that's why I think the issue of when the routes are open and who's going where really matters, right? Where do people have their own social networks within which they are, in a sense, making social bonds with other people who can become Christian?
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I mean, rather than go all the way to India to get your curry, you could just maybe go down somewhere like Bahrain or, Mesopotamia or somewhere in Persia or the Sassanid Empire, buy some there because someone else has already done the other half of the journey. But if people set up shop there, then you could get a local tradition that maybe later could then migrate to India. I mean, that's the sort of argument I thought you were making in the book. There was a limited number of direct contact between the Roman world and India because, why go all the way when someone else is doing the other half of the trip? Nathaniel, can you tell us about, the Acts of Thomas? Because this is sort of, the main work that people are looking at for the somewhat, call it, legendary or hagiographical account of how Christianity came tradition. So can you give us the basic story of the Acts of Thomas as if you were giving us a, the 2-minute rundown for a freshman class?
Sure, absolutely. So the basic gist of the narrative is that after Jesus is crucified and resurrected, the apostles draw lots to figure out where they're supposed to preach. And so there's clearly an imitation of the narrative of the Acts of the Apostles. There's a notion that the apostles are now going to go out and they're going to convert various regions. Judas Thomas draws India, or casted, I should probably say. And I imagine dice when they're doing it, of course. And he refuses to go. And then when Jesus appears to him and tells him to go, he still is stubborn and doesn't do it. And so in a very interesting element of the narrative, the resurrected Jesus basically sells him into enslavement to a merchant from India that happens to be in Jerusalem at the time. And from there, he ends up essentially in India, where he's supposed to build a palace for a king that seems to be based on an historical kernel. And what's in some ways a comical situation. The king doesn't understand that Thomas is building him a palace in heaven. He's building one on earth. And after giving Thomas a lot of money, he gets very angry when he discovers that there's no palace that he can actually visibly see. But then his brother dies. And what happens is that his brother has, a paranormal moment, for lack of a better way of putting it, or a spiritual moment in which he can see the palace and the angels. And then when he comes back to life, he tells this king about what's happened. And really from there, Thomas is doing a lot of proselytizing in India. He very much is an advocate for celibacy, and that tends to get him into trouble because he's always telling women not to sleep with their husbands. And usually the response is that they want to kill him. And that's more or less how, in the narrative that survives for us, he ends up being martyred. He befriends a lot of royal women, but their husbands are very angry and they're able to get a king to sign his death warrant in a sense.
Okay, and that's it. But this is probably based on an earlier story of Thomas going to Parthia, not India, because as you mentioned, the book Origin, the 3rd century Christian scholar from Alexandria, he mentions in his Genesis commentary about Thomas going to Parthia. So I think a number of scholars say, well, the 4th century Thomasine story is probably based on an earlier story, maybe first composed in Greek, if I remember correctly, about Thomas going to Parthia. So, I mean, can you tell us about an early Parthian source for the Acts of Thomas?
Right, of course. It's a challenging source to talk about because it doesn't really exist for us. But as you mentioned, we do get these references in some of the writings of early Christian authors that talk about Thomas as basically being the evangelist of Parthia, and they don't really mention India. And people have debated the relationship between the surviving version and this version in various ways. But the perspective I favor is that there probably was a situation early on where Thomas was associated with Parthia. And that's what Christians who heard about Thomas, well, that's what they associated him with, going to Parthian territory and preaching. And then at some point, his area of preaching gets changed to India. And as far as I can tell, it's really not before the 3rd century that anyone's really talking about him as going to India. Although once that tradition is established, people are going to talk about it all the time. They're always going to associate Thomas with India. And they also will assume that Christians are there on the basis of the Acts of Thomas.
Okay, that's interesting. There was one other figure who was meant to go to India as well after Thomas, and that is the Alexandrian theologian Pantaenus, who was kind of the predecessor of Clement of Alexandria.
Right.
What can you tell me about Pantaenus? Did he really go to India, or did he go to the bit of Ethiopia or Arabia that people call India, which would be a lot nearer?
Right. Well, my belief is that the discussion that we get from the source material like Eusebius and Jerome is really based on a journey that happened somewhere in either East Africa or the Red Sea region or Arabia. And when Rufinus, right, was translating Eusebius's narrative, that's what he seemed to have believed, intriguingly. So he takes a reference that Eusebius makes to India generically, and he actually specifies that it's a part of India, so-called, that's actually much nearer to Egypt. He uses the terminology of that period that typically localizes it more to East Africa. So what I think was happening here is that this Pantaenus fellow had a reputation for going to India. But of course, the question is, which India? Yeah. And I think when other church fathers started to write about him and so forth, they just assumed it was the subcontinental India and not necessarily all the other places that could be called India that are much closer to Egypt, for example, or Alexandria.
Yeah, well, again, that's an interesting story. It depends on what India you're talking about. I mean, I could say I'm going to America and I end up like in, American Samoa, which is, technically an American colony, but it's nowhere near Los Angeles or New York, but it's under a sort of American or species. It's probably the best analogy I can think of. One interesting piece of literature, or one instance of the migration of literature and people, is the Book of Elkasai, which is a book about like an angel who's like 6 miles tall. He's got some friends and he's called the Son of God and that kind of thing. And this book was allegedly from Northwest China, I believe, from is it the series? Is that you pronounce it, the series or the Keres?
Oh, yeah, the series, yeah.
The series, which gets handed on to a baptismal sect in, Mesopotamia, and then eventually gets allegedly brought to Rome. What does that narrative tell you about the way people imagined the migration of literature and religion? Is this all imaginative, or did people think, yeah, that sounds reasonable? You get something from Northwest China and it can end up in Rome, a few decades later?
Well, I think that what fascinates me about the material in which that book appears, right? And so it's talked about by third parties who, of course, as you point out, very interested in this fascinating text and right, and what it says. I think its significance lies in how even the ancients were oftentimes aware that in spite of all these narratives that circulate about, say, how an apostle could go to the ends of the earth and make conversions, what we get in the discussion about the Book of Elkasai is this awareness that religious culture changes hands, right? So you have this book that originates with the series, and it comes from somewhere in Northwest China or Central Asia, but then it ends up in Mesopotamia, and there's a community there that treasures it. And then someone from Syria somehow gets that text from Mesopotamia, and he's connected to Rome in some way, and he brings it. And what really fascinated me about the conversation or the narrative about that book that happens in like Hippolytus or pseudo-Hippolytus was how there seems to be this recognition that a lot of the time when religious culture travels, it really is changing hands. And it can cover vast distances, but it also might mean that the pace at which it travels can be relatively slow. At the same time. So it may not be, say, a grand narrative where Christianity just travels to, say, the Mediterranean to India in a matter of a decade, but it's a process in which culture travels, it gets integrated into religious community, they make their own contacts, it travels further on. And that's what the discussion about the Book of Elkasai, the ancient literature, seems to really be suggesting about it.
Okay, so it's simply part of the slow migration of literature as it happened in the ancient world. Interesting point. Well, that comes down to, I guess, the main question then, Nathanael. When did Christianity actually arrive in India and who brought it there? Now, I've got to tell you, there is actually a Mar Thomas church just down the road from where I work. So it's like 500 meters. I think it's about to be pulled down. They're going to turn into a bunch of apartments, I think. But there's I know Mar Thoma church just down the road. I've been in there a couple of times, and it's a wonderful, quiet place of prayer. And there's an Indian expat community that up until recently worshipped there. So if they ask me as the local expert on church history, so when did Christianity actually arrive in India? What should I tell them?
Well, that's a very tough one. And this gets to the heart of, I think, what made it very tough to write the book in many ways, right? So according to Thomas Christians, Christianity gets to India with Thomas. And there are, of course, other narratives about how Christianity arrives later or gets revived by various people that travel to India. But certainly a very important kernel is the Acts of Thomas and this tradition that the Apostle Thomas came to India and proselytized there. And you mentioned at the beginning of the segment, you don't know where I fall spiritually or anything like that. But I've always sort of believed that there's a big difference between spiritual truth and, say, historical truth. Right? You can believe in the spiritual message in a sense of a text without necessarily believing that everything in it is historical. But the challenge is, of course, that this tradition of Thomas's arrival is something that's clearly very much treasured by Christians living today, right? Who really see the origins of their community in that narrative. And so the tough part was for me to basically say, well, I don't really think that it happened the way that the Acts of Thomas suggest, or the way that the hymns of the Thomas Christians suggest. I think that what occurred was a phenomenon where eventually Christians living in, say, lower Mesopotamia, maybe coastal Fars, they're settling in South India, especially the Kerala coast, right, where the Thomas Christians have their communities by and large today. And it's really they who bring Christianity and enable it to take root in South India. And they also bring the Thomas tradition with them. They actually bring this narrative, which can always be revived by Christian communities as they encounter it. So I don't know what I would say if I were you. My inclination is to think it's, a 6th century phenomenon in essence. But it's a challenge because I know that not everyone necessarily wants to part ways with how they see things historically.
Yeah.
And that's tough. And for me, I think it's about the spiritual truth, and that's something that anyone can embrace.
Yeah, but, I mean, you can still think Thomas is a great apostle, even if he only went as far as Parthia.
Right.
I'm sure he was still a good apostle, even if he didn't really bring Christianity to India. So, I mean, when I was reading the book, the only area that made me think, this is the evidence for this is fairly spasmodic and ad hoc, and we're just giving our best guessworks on what we know of the archaeology, the networks, and the literature. But I did wonder whether it's possible that, Christianity may not have got there in the 1st century with Thomas. I accept the Acts of Thomas is hagiography. But I did wonder if it was possible that maybe it got there ahead of the 6th century. And the two things that make me wonder that is the way that Buddhism spread from Central Asia, getting to the Roman Empire, certainly in the 1st century. Clement of Alexandria seems to be referring to Buddhists in their own language as ascetics. So Clement of Alexandria seems to know some technical terminology about Buddhism. And then in the 3rd century, you've got the very fast spread of Manicheanism, from Central Asia up into the Caucasus, Arabia, and certainly into North Africa as well, where it then becomes a major competitor or rival to Christianity in the 4th and 5th century. So I'm looking at the two analogies we have to the spread of a religious movement in Buddhism and Manichaeism. And I'm thinking, well, if they spread fairly quickly, why not Christianity as well? I can understand materially you could say, look, we can't really be definitive until the 6th century, but I thought the analogy with those two other religions might say, well, actually you can, this is a bit of a trade highway here, so maybe it happened a little bit quicker. What would you say to that sort of reasoning?
It's a fascinating question, and it's one that inspired a lot of lack of confidence, I would say, when I was finishing the book. And of course, anything I say should be prefaced by my own limitations when it comes to understanding Manichaeism or Buddhism. But for me, I guess the way that I think about it now is that it's not so much that Christianity couldn't have traveled, and who knows, maybe it did. You may be right. Maybe just we're not getting that closure, right, from literary or material evidence that we otherwise would want. But for me, it's not so much that it couldn't do it. It's more that it just didn't. And the way that I typically think about it is that when you're dealing with Buddhism and Manichaeism, the tendency is to proselytize, establish communities, particularly in urban centers. They can be relatively small, but there, in my understanding, doesn't seem to be an impulse to convert every single soul who lives nearby, right? And so at least in my imagination, it may just be my imagination, and you're of course free to say this, I see these communities establishing cells in urban areas, and they lay down roots, and they have a small, kind of intimate community that might have its own internal hierarchy. And then they're proselytizing further afield, and they're converting kings, or they're converting some sort of dynast, or they're laying roots in urban areas. And that's sort of how I think of Buddhism and Manichaeism. What I think happens with Christianity eventually is that there's sort of this mentality that, okay, we have this community or communities in an urban area, but what about all these people living in the countryside who aren't Christian? We need to go and convert them and bring them into the fold. And my understanding of Christianity is that shortly after, say, Jesus of Nazareth's death, when you start to have the Jesus movement and the rise of Christianity, it looks a lot more like Buddhism and Manichaeism, right? You have these people, they're preaching mostly predominantly in urban areas that are well connected on trade routes. They're establishing relatively small, intimate, church communities and the like. But I think what happens is that eventually there's a shift, and a lot of the authorities, when it comes to like their interest in converting people, it's typically about what's local, I think, and not necessarily about what's, say, universal throughout the continent of, say, Asia or anything like that. There are, of course, exceptions, and naturally, as various types of Christians are on the move, they're going to make converts premeditatively or opportunistically. But at least in my thinking, very generally speaking, I think there's a point where Christians start to do a lot of their converting locally, right? So we're in the city, we're going to the countryside, but we're not necessarily worrying about the city on the opposite end of an ocean, so to speak. But I know it's not a satisfactory answer, just because there is a lot of overlap, I think, between the way that these religions actually do make converts and move across Asia. And so that's sort of my not so satisfactory answer, but it's one that I think it's worth asking and thinking a lot about. And maybe sometimes someone will answer it or discover that maybe Christianity did just move just as fast as Manicheanism.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. We've got to say, well, with what we know did happen to what we think is theoretically possible. You know, we can say our limited material evidence means empirically we know it was there by the 6th century. Maybe possibly it got there earlier, but we don't know for certain. So, I mean, I guess that's the levels of certainty and sort of the questions we have when we're doing a lot of these areas, which are a little bit of evidence and a little bit of speculation and a little bit of trying to connect the dots that when there's breaks between them. So that's, right, I guess, the craft of the historian. So, well, again, for those watching, this is the book, The Journey of Christianity into to India in Late Antiquity, Networks and the Movement of Culture. Terrific book, certainly worth looking at. Rather than have a very Eurocentric or American-centric view of early church history, I do recommend books like these because it's good to know that Europe and North America are not the main places where Christianity took root, at least not for the first, millennia or so. And there was a big church in the East, which often is neglected and forgotten. But I've got to ask, Nathanael, do you have another book? You've done Syrian identity, you've done India. Are you heading further east? Are you going out to China for something else?
I do have in the works. About the same year that Christianity in India came out, I published a book about Zenobia of Palmyra, which I was sort of working on at the same time. And now I'm actually working on a project about Syrian diasporas in the ancient world. And I'm trying to somehow integrate the movement of Syrians throughout the Mediterranean and the world of Iran. And it would involve Christianity, though the direction I'm going to take with that book is still yet to be determined. I'm still making key decisions about where to go. But at least in terms of initial stages, that's where I'm at.
Excellent. Well, that's a good reminder. I need to read your Queen Zenobia book, who is a lady who carved out her own little empire in the 3rd century amidst Roman disintegration, if I remember correctly. Quite amazing, sandwiched between the Sassanids and the Romans. She kind of carved out her own little fiefdom, which is quite an achievement to be able to do that. So, well, that's a good reminder to read that book. Very important for 3rd century history in Syria. Well, Nathanael, it has been terrific to talk with you. This has been a really good discussion, and I hope people have learned a lot about Christianity, literature, culture, trade networks in the ancient world.
Well, thanks for having me here. It's been a pleasure to talk about the book with you, and I look forward to more watching your podcast in the future.
Thank you very much, Nathanael.
Right.